All right, so our first conversation today, we're looking at smarter policy, monetary policy, and here, and Nigeria's economy has struggled with, in a couple of years ago, unstable inflation. Though we're seeing inflation trending downward now, exchange rate volatility and high interest rate. But what if the real problem is not just policy direction, but policy decision? My guest today, Dr. Olajide Oyadeyi of Kingsgate Advisors Institute, has a new policy brief arguing for smarter calibration using, clear economic thresholds. He joins us now to explain what Nigeria needs to get right to unlock stable and sustainable growth. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Ladi.
Fantastic. So your paper moves the debate from, general targets to, specific thresholds for inflation, exchange rate, and interest rate. Which of these variables is most critical for Nigeria to get right first? And why does your evidence, suggest that kind of prioritization?
Thank you for the question, Ladi. In terms of which of the three variables I feel should come first, I think that that is one of the things that we've been facing over the past couple of years, whereby we focus mostly on just one of the monetary policy variables, and how we use that to be able to solve, the economic problems, particularly inflation and GDP growth. So if by what has been happening in Nigeria is anything that I am going to use to answer this question, then that would be the monetary policy rate. But one of the arguments of the paper is that we need to shift away from only using, the monetary policy instruments such as, the monetary policy rate, which is a discount rate policy, as well as OMO instruments and the reserves to be able to, conduct monetary policy activities. Now, I'm not saying that we should move away from it, but I'm saying that there has to be a consolidation amongst other monetary policy instruments that we can use to solve monetary policy conditions in the economy. Take, for instance, exchange rates, as we can see over the last 3 years, have been has been volatile, right? Except for maybe sometime last year, the beginning of this year, we're beginning to see a lot of stability within the exchange rate framework. But again, you could see that what has happened as a result of, the constant depreciation in exchange rate from, I think, about 360, at the official and non-official markets in 2022 to about 1,500 as our last year, before trickling down to about 1,000, I think, 445, towards the end of 2025. You could see that led to, rising inflation in the economy, which was affected through, imported inflation typically, because when you depreciate your exchange rates, what it means is that imports become very expensive, for you to import. And as a result, that has a pass-on effect or a spillover effect into, the cost of, selling some of these goods. And even if it's going to be used to make products or, goods and services, it has a pass-on effect to increase the cost of, input of goods and services in the Nigerian economy. So I would say that, like you rightly said, like you asked, which one of them has been very important? What I'm trying to say here is that we need to start thinking about not just which is very important, but how we can, use the current monetary policy framework to be able to tackle the existing problems, which is constant exchange rate depreciation, rising inflation rate, as well as a high monetary policy rate. Because again, if I should go into inflation, Nigeria has constantly been using interest rates, which is the monetary policy rate, to be able to solve Nigeria's inflation quagmire. And again, what we've been able to see is that inflation in Nigeria is currently driven by supply side events, such as, like I mentioned earlier, the exchange rate pass through of inflation, of imported inflation, food security crisis, farmers, herdsmen clashes that we constantly see in the northern part of the country, then the security apparatus. So again, using monetary policy instruments to solve these, some of these issues, may not be the most effective way to go about policy planning in the economy, because these are supply side constraints, and those supply side constraints must be tackled using supply side measures. That is, those measures that can help, reduce the effect of some of these supply side constraints on the Nigerian economy. And that is why you will see that, the monetary policy rate, despite, hiking, despite its hike, currently at 27%, it's still not been able to, bring down inflation to the levels that can become sustainable.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah. Definitely we did enjoy some stability most of, 2025. And now, definitely we're seeing projections now that we need to consolidate on what we enjoyed, the stability we enjoyed in 2025. But, based on your identified thresholds, how far is Nigeria's current, macroeconomic environment from what you described as growth supporting zone? And which policy mistakes do you think are most responsible for keeping us outside of that zone?
Okay, let me start from the second question, which is which policy mistakes. I wouldn't want to emphasize policy mistakes because there are none. What I want to emphasize is policy effectiveness, right? So in terms of the first question, which how far outside, so we're still a bit far, but again, Nigeria has been able to attain stability in 2025, which is a very, very good progress from where we're coming from, especially in 2022, 2023, and 2024. So in terms of the numbers, the thresholds show that, for Nigeria, for growth to become sustainable in Nigeria, then inflation has to be, at single digits. The research shows about 9.37%. If you take a look at, Nigeria's inflation as of December, which is 15.15%, that shows you that we're still about 5%, more than the actual target. And what does this target mean? It means that, anything below this target can help support growth in Nigeria. But anything above the target, it's not going to be growth supporting. Rather, it can be growth harming. And that is why, even though, Nigeria is most likely going to see a growth of about 4%, 3.8% to 4% in 2025, there are still many arguments, that it has not trickled down into, the business environment. This growth is still too weak to be able to support, welfare, to be able to support employment, and to be able to support the weak and the most vulnerable households in the Nigerian economy. So these are one of the things that the paper, argues for. Again, secondly, in terms of exchange rates, exchange rates spiked to very high levels, and what the reports technically showed is that exchange rates should not go beyond 2.37% a year for it to be growth sustaining. And what that tells you is that as a result, what we are proposing is that there should be a credible target for exchange rates, for inflation rates, and for interest rates that can help support growth, and economic activities in Nigeria. Without those credible targets, it becomes, very difficult or tricky to say, oh, yes, the monetary authorities or the fiscal authorities, are performing well. So with this target, we can then use those targets as a yardstick for us to be able to judge, the performance of the activities, of the monetary authorities. The final part is on the bit of interest rate. So interest rate is still very high at 27%, and the policy work helped show that, any rate above 16.5% is growth harming. So just to understand a bit of some of the zones, right? The report also showed that Treasury bill rate should not exceed 14.5%. Otherwise, it crowds out, borrowing from the private sector, because what you see is that it's only the government that will be able to borrow, from through the bonds market, right? Because at a very high rate, it becomes a disincentive for businesses, to borrow. As a result, this weakens investment, and crowds out the private system from being able to get, loans that can help, serve as a catalyst to economic growth in Nigeria. So what this is trying to say is that, at a treasury bill rate of about 14.5% and a monetary policy rate of about 16.5%, it shows that, when your monetary policy rate is within those two bands, right, that's a warning zone to say that, look, interest rate is already rising. Anything above 14.5%, it's a warning zone to say, look, whatever we are doing, we're already almost in an overheating period. But anything above 16.5% tells you that, monetary policy is already overheating. And what that means is that any continuous hike in interest rates or any continuous hawkish stance in interest rates is going to have, a reduced, it's going to have negative consequences on the economic activities in the country, and which is what we currently have today. Yes, growth, Nigeria is expected to grow about 4%, in 2025. And again, going into 2026, we expect Nigeria to grow at about, 4.5% and the like. But again, for growth to become sustainable in an emerging market and a developing economy like Nigeria, we need to be targeting at least 5%. And the only way we can achieve this 5% to about maybe roughly 8 or 9%. And the only way we can achieve this is to ensure that, we bring inflation down to levels below, to single digits, that is 9% and below. Okay. We bring, interest rates down to below 16.5%, and exchange rate depreciation should not exceed 2.37% at the official market and about 2.5%, at the parallel market. Above this rate, it has, negative consequences on the Nigerian economy. But below this rate, it tends to support growth, which then tends to have positive outcomes on the Nigerian economy.
Right, and definitely we need a lot of support right now for the economy. But definitely with a huge population, 7 to 8% of economic growth, definitely that would help. Thank you so much, Dr. Olajide. Oyadeyi is a Kingsgate Advisor Institute there. He's joining us from there, one of their top minds on that team. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.